My father-in-law found gold in our basement and destroyed our house digging for it. So, I convinced him the government confiscated it all. My wife Megan and I bought our house 5 years ago from an elderly couple who'd lived there since the 50s. It was a ranch-style house with a basement and a big backyard where we wanted to raise kids. Megan's father, Roy, had been a geology professor before retiring and always talked about mineral deposits and rock formations. He was 70 and spent his retirement buying old mining claims and searching for precious metals with no success. When we bought the house, Roy insisted on checking the property with his metal detector as a housewarming gift. We thought it was weird but harmless, so we let him walk around the yard for an afternoon. He found some old nails and a horseshoe and seemed satisfied. 3 years later, we decided to expand the basement for a home gym. The contractor, Luis, was digging out a corner when his machine hit something metallic. He called us down and showed us what looked like gold flakes in a small vein running through the rock. Luis said he'd seen this before in old properties and we should get it checked. We had a sample tested quietly, and it came back as real gold. Not a lot, but maybe worth $50,000 if we excavated carefully. Megan and I decided to keep it secret and slowly extract it ourselves over time. We told Luis to continue the basement as planned, and we'd deal with the gold area ourselves later. That was our mistake because Luis mentioned something to his cousin, who worked with Roy's former colleague at the university. Within a week, Roy showed up at our door with mining equipment. He said he'd heard we might have found something interesting and wanted to help. We tried to play dumb, but Roy had already figured it out. He pushed past us and went straight to the basement, where he started examining the walls with a magnifying glass. He found the vein immediately and started shouting about the mother lode. We told Roy we wanted to handle this ourselves, but he said we didn't know what we were doing. He said one wrong move and we'd destroy the deposit. He said he'd been waiting his whole life for this. He actually started crying about destiny and second chances. Roy came back the next morning with a truck full of equipment. Jackhammers, picks, buckets, sifting screens, even chemistry equipment to test purity. He'd spent $15,000 in one day. When we tried to stop him, he reminded us that he'd paid for Megan's college and wedding, and this was how we could pay him back. He actually calculated interest and said we owed him $200,000. The gold might be worth $50,000 if we were lucky. Roy started working in our basement 12 hours a day. He'd show up at 5 in the morning and stay until dark. He knocked out walls we hadn't approved. He dug channels in the floor that flooded when it rained. He ran industrial equipment that shook the whole house and cracked the foundation. Our neighbors called the police about the noise, but Roy told them it was home renovation, and technically it was. After 2 weeks, Roy had extracted about $8,000 worth of gold dust and nuggets. The basement was destroyed. The foundation was compromised. The city inspector came by and nearly condemned the house. We had to pay $20,000 for emergency repairs just to make it safe. Roy didn't care because he was convinced there was more gold deeper down. He wanted to dig under the entire house. He brought in ground-penetrating radar and claimed he could see veins going in every direction. He started talking about buying the neighbors' houses to follow the gold. He tried to get a loan using our house as collateral since Megan was on the deed. The bank called us confused about why Roy was trying to borrow against our property. That's when I came up with a plan. I had my friend Diego, who worked for the state, come by in an official-looking truck. Diego wore a suit and carried a clipboard and introduced himself as being from the Department of Natural Resources. He told Roy that satellite imaging had detected unusual mineral extraction at our address. He said any gold found on residential property belonged to the state under the Mineral Rights Act of 1987, which I'd completely made up. Roy went ballistic, saying the government couldn't steal what he'd found. Diego stayed calm and said Roy could keep what he'd already extracted, but any further digging would result in prosecution. He handed Roy fake paperwork with official-looking seals and said the state would be monitoring the property. Roy tried to research the law, but I'd created a fake government website that confirmed everything Diego said. The site looked so real that Roy's lawyer told him to stop digging immediately. Roy spent the next month trying to fight the fake law. He went to the state capitol and demanded to see the Mineral Rights Department, which didn't exist. He wrote letters to congressmen about government overreach. He started a petition that no one signed because no one cared about his gold. 6 months later, while fixing a pipe that burst in the wall Roy hadn't touched, our plumber's hammer went straight through into a hollow space behind the foundation, revealing a cavern lined with gleaming veins of gold so thick they looked like tree roots. The geological survey we had done in secret estimated it at $12 million. I sit in my basement staring at the cavern opening the plumber accidentally created, watching gold veins glitter in the flashlight beam like some kind of cosmic joke. The geological survey Ralph completed in secret yesterday confirmed $12 million worth of gold, and I feel physically sick knowing what I've done to Roy. Megan stands beside me in complete silence, and I know we're both thinking the same impossible thought about how our little deception just became something way worse. The veins run through the rock like frozen lightning, thick as my wrist in some places, branching out in patterns that look almost alive. I move the flashlight beam across the cavern wall and watch the gold shimmer, and my stomach turns over because Roy spent 6 months fighting a fake law to get back to exactly this. Megan reaches out and touches one of the veins, pulling her hand back fast like it burned her. She looks at me with tears running down her face and doesn't say anything because there's nothing to say that makes this okay. The cavern extends back further than our flashlight reaches, disappearing into darkness that probably runs under half our property. I think about Roy in his garage right now, probably looking at his mining equipment and feeling like a failure, while we stand here looking at his actual dream come true. Megan finally speaks and asks what we're going to do, and I don't have an answer because every option feels terrible in a different way. We climb back up the basement stairs, and I seal the hole with a piece of plywood, covering up $12 million like it's just another home repair project. That night, Megan and I sit at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, going through every possible option and hating all of them. Confessing means admitting we lied to her father for 6 months, destroyed his dream twice, and potentially face legal trouble for fraud and forging government documents. Staying silent means living with this secret forever, while we extract a fortune that Roy spent his entire retirement searching for. I write down the options on a piece of paper, like making a list will somehow make the choice easier. Option 1, tell Roy everything and deal with whatever happens. Option 2, keep quiet and take the gold. Option 3, tell Roy about the gold, but lie about the timing and the fake government stuff. Megan points out that option 3 won't work because Roy will ask questions we can't answer without more lies. She gets up and makes coffee even though it's past midnight because neither of us is sleeping tonight anyway. I ask her what she thinks her dad would do if we told him the truth, and she says he'd probably never speak to us again. She starts crying again and says her dad looked so happy last week when he told her he was finally at peace with everything. I remind her that Roy tried to take out a loan against our house without asking, that he caused $20,000 in damage and never offered to pay a cent. Megan snaps back that none of that matters because we're talking about stealing his life's dream right out from under him. We go in circles like this for hours, getting nowhere except more tired and more guilty. I spend the next 2 days calling Ralph back repeatedly, making him verify the survey results because surely this can't be real. He sends me core samples that arrive in a small box, chunks of rock with gold veins running through them that look like something from a museum. The mineral composition analysis comes through email, pages of technical data that I don't fully understand, but that all point to the same conclusion. Ralph calls me back sounding annoyed and asks why I keep questioning his professional assessment. I tell him it's just hard to believe, and he says he's been doing geological surveys for 30 years, and this is the biggest residential gold deposit he's ever seen. The cavern extends under most of our property, and possibly into the neighbor's yard, with gold veins so thick and pure that Ralph called it a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. He emails me volume calculations showing approximately $11 to $13 million worth of gold, depending on current market prices and extraction efficiency. I sit at my desk, staring at these numbers, and thinking about how Roy spent $15,000 on equipment to find $50,000 worth of gold, and the whole time $12 million was sitting behind a wall he never touched. Ralph asks if I want him to do a more detailed survey of the neighbor's property, and I tell him not yet because I need time to think. He says I shouldn't wait too long because geological surveys like this have professional reporting requirements that he's already stretching by keeping quiet. I thank him and hang up, then sit there feeling the weight of this secret getting heavier by the minute. Megan goes to visit her father for their regular Sunday dinner and comes back looking completely wrecked. She walks in the door and immediately starts crying before she even takes off her coat. I ask what happened, and she says Roy spent the whole meal talking about finally accepting that the government won, how he's tired of fighting, and how he's proud that he at least found something real even if he couldn't keep it. She tells me he looked older and more defeated than she's ever seen him, with new wrinkles around his eyes and his hands shaking slightly when he poured coffee. Roy told her he's been thinking about his life and realizing he wasted years chasing gold when he should have been enjoying retirement. He said the fake government intervention was probably the universe telling him to let go of his obsession and focus on what really matters. Megan sits down at the kitchen table and puts her head in her hands, saying she almost told him everything right there but couldn't make the words come out. She says her dad hugged her when she left and told her he loved her, and she felt like the worst daughter in the world. I try to comfort her, but she pushes me away, saying I don't understand, because it's not my father we're lying to. She's right, and I know it. But I also know that telling Roy now would destroy him just as much as the lie is destroying us. She goes upstairs without eating dinner, and I hear her crying through the bedroom door. I meet with Christopher Dean, a real estate attorney I found through Ralph's recommendation, to understand the legal situation around the gold. His office is downtown in one of those old buildings with wood paneling and leather chairs that smell like furniture polish. Christopher is maybe 50 with gray hair and reading glasses that he keeps taking on and off while reviewing documents. I tell him I need to understand mineral rights on residential property, being vague about why I'm asking. Christopher explains that since the gold is on our property, and we own the mineral rights according to our deed, it's legally ours to extract. He pulls out our property deed and shows me the section about mineral rights, pointing to the specific language that gives us ownership of anything found under our land. I ask about situations where someone else discovered the minerals first, and Christopher says discovery doesn't matter, only property ownership does. He never asks why I need this confirmed so carefully, but I can tell he suspects something unusual about the situation based on how specific my questions are. Christopher explains the tax implications of mineral extraction and recommends I talk to a financial advisor before doing anything. He charges me $300 for the consultation and hands me his card in case I need follow-up advice. I leave his office feeling like I just got permission to do something terrible, even though technically everything he said was about legal rights and not moral ones. Ralph introduces me to Albert McGrath, a mining extraction expert who specializes in residential property excavation. We meet at a coffee shop near my house, and Albert brings his wife Marlene, who handles the financial side of their business. Albert is a big guy in his 60s with calloused hands and a weathered face that looks like he's spent decades working outdoors. Marlene is sharp and professional, pulling out a laptop and spreadsheets before we even order coffee. Albert reviews the cavern survey that Ralph provided and lets out a low whistle, saying he's never seen anything like this in a residential setting. He estimates we could extract the gold over 18 months using careful, quiet methods that wouldn't attract neighborhood attention. Albert explains they'd use hand tools and small equipment, working during normal business hours so it looks like regular home renovation. Marlene pulls up her spreadsheets and starts calculating extraction costs, equipment rental, labor, permits for the fake foundation work, and taxes. She calculates that after extraction costs and taxes, we'd clear approximately $8 million. Albert says they could start within a month if we want to move forward, and they'd handle everything including the cover story about foundation repairs. Marlene slides a contract across the table for me to review, and I tell them I need time to think about it. Albert nods and says he understands this is a big decision, but he mentions his crew's schedule fills up fast, and waiting too long might mean missing the window. They give me their contact information and leave me sitting there with a contract that would make us rich and guilty forever. Megan finds me researching extraction methods at 2 a.m. and completely loses it, yelling that I'm actually planning to steal her father's dream right in front of his face. She's standing in the doorway of my office in her pajamas, and I didn't even hear her come downstairs. I try to close the laptop, but she's already seen the mining websites and Albert's contract pulled up on the screen. She asks if I've completely lost my mind, and I try to explain that it's legally ours and Roy would destroy the house trying to get it. She says I sound like a stranger justifying something horrible, that she doesn't even recognize me right now. I point out that Roy caused $20,000 in damage and tried to commit loan fraud with our house, and she screams that none of that makes this okay. Megan says her father was sick with obsession, and we used that sickness against him, and now I want to profit from it. I tell her we have a choice between being honest and being secure, and she says if that's really the choice, then our marriage is based on lies anyway. She asks how I can even consider this, and I admit I don't know anymore, that every option feels wrong, but doing nothing also feels impossible. Megan says she's sleeping in the guest room and walks out, slamming the door hard enough that pictures rattle on the wall. I sit there in the dark with my laptop glowing, feeling like I just lost something important, even though I'm not sure what. This is our worst fight in 5 years of marriage, and I know it's not really about the gold, it's about what kind of people we're choosing to become. I drive to Roy's house the next morning unannounced, planning to confess everything. But when I get there, he's in his garage surrounded by all his mining equipment that he's trying to sell online. His garage door is open, and I can see him pricing items on his phone, writing numbers on pieces of masking tape and sticking them to his equipment. The jackhammer that costs $3,000 has a tag that says 500. His chemistry set for testing gold purity is marked at 200. I park on the street and walk up the driveway, and Roy looks up surprised to see me. He says he's making peace with how things turned out, that maybe the universe was telling him he was too old for this dream anyway. Roy shows me his phone with the online listings he's created, talking about how he'll probably only get back $6,000 or $7,000 total, but at least someone else can use the equipment. He picks up his favorite rock hammer and looks at it for a long moment before setting it down with a price tag. I stand there watching him price his equipment at a fraction of what he paid, and I can't make the words come out. Roy asks if I want any of his geology books, since I've shown some interest in rocks, and I tell him sure even though I haven't shown any interest at all. He goes inside to get the books, and I stand in his garage looking at the evidence of his shattered dream being sold off piece by piece. When he comes back with a box of books, I take them and thank him and leave without saying what I came to say. I sit in my car down the street for 20 minutes trying to work up the courage to go back, but I finally just drive home. I call Diego in a panic and tell him about the $12 million discovery and how I don't know what to do. He's quiet for a long time before saying that sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing, and I need to decide which kind of person I want to be. Diego reminds me that Roy tried to commit loan fraud with our house and never apologized, that he caused $20,000 in damage and never offered to pay, and that keeping quiet isn't the same as stealing. I tell him it feels like stealing when Roy spent his whole life looking for this, and we're taking it from him. Diego says Roy was going to destroy our house and our financial security, and we stopped him the only way we could. He points out that Roy is actually happier now than he was when he was obsessed with gold, that his health has improved and he's at peace. I ask if that makes the lie okay, and Diego says he doesn't know about okay, but maybe it's the least bad option in a situation with no good choices. He tells me he'll support whatever I decide, but I need to make a decision soon, because sitting in limbo is eating me alive. We talk for over an hour, and by the end I don't feel better, but at least I feel less alone with this choice. Diego says he's sorry he helped create this situation, and I tell him it's not his fault, that I'm the one who asked him to lie in the first place. Megan and I go to couples counseling for the first time, though we can't tell the therapist the real issue, so we talk around it using vague terms about family secrets and financial decisions. The therapist is a woman in her 40s named Dr. Whitmore, who has a calm voice that makes me want to tell her everything. We sit on opposite ends of her couch, and she asks what brought us in today. Megan says we're struggling with a moral dilemma involving her father and money, and we can't agree on what to do. Dr. Whitmore asks us to describe the situation without being specific, and we do our best to explain the basic conflict without mentioning gold or lies or fake government departments. She asks what values we want our marriage to be based on, and we both sit there unable to answer because honesty and security seem mutually exclusive right now. Megan says she values truth and family relationships above money, and I say I value protecting our future and not enabling destructive behavior. Dr. Whitmore points out that we're both right from different perspectives, and that's what makes the situation so difficult. She asks what we think will happen 5 years from now, based on each choice, and neither of us has a good answer. The session ends with homework about clarifying our values and communicating better, but we leave feeling worse instead of better, because the therapy just highlighted how stuck we really are. We drive home in silence, and I know we're both thinking the same thing, that no amount of counseling can solve a problem this fundamentally broken. 3 days passed before Roy called. I saw his name on my phone screen and felt my stomach drop. Megan was upstairs putting away laundry, and I answered in the kitchen, gripping the counter edge with my free hand. Roy's voice sounded tired but calm. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking about everything that happened with the gold. He said he wanted to apologize for how crazy he got, for the destruction he caused, for trying to take out that loan against our house without asking. He said he'd been talking to his therapist about obsession and how it made him lose sight of what mattered. I told him it was okay, that we understood, while staring directly at the basement door 20 feet away. He said he was dropping his legal fight against the government because his lawyer finally convinced him it was pointless. He said maybe the universe was telling him something by taking the gold away. I made agreeing sounds and felt like the worst person alive. He asked if we could all have dinner soon to celebrate moving forward, and I said yes because what else could I say? After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes just breathing. Megan came downstairs and asked who called. I told her and watched her face go pale. She sat down across from me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. 2 days later, I got an email from someone named Albert McGrath with the subject line, "Extraction Proposal." Ralph had given him my contact information. The email had 3 attachments. The first was a detailed plan for extracting the gold using specialized equipment that wouldn't make much noise. Albert explained they could install soundproofing panels in the basement and use vibration dampening systems that would make the work almost silent. The second attachment was from his wife Marlene, who handled financial planning. She'd created spreadsheets showing how we could extract the gold in phases over 18 months. She'd calculated extraction costs, proper tax payments, investment strategies, and final net worth projections. The numbers said we'd end up with about $8 million after everything. The third attachment was a cover story about foundation repairs that would explain any activity at the house. Albert had thought of everything, including permits we'd need to file and inspection schedules we'd have to follow. The proposal was so professional and thorough that it made the whole thing feel almost legitimate. I read through all 3 documents twice and felt sick. This wasn't some vague possibility anymore. These were actual plans with timelines and budgets and legal structures. I could click reply and set this whole thing in motion. I saved the files to a password-protected folder on my computer and didn't respond. Megan found me staring at my laptop screen an hour later. She asked what I was looking at, and I told her. She read through Albert's proposal without saying anything. When she finished, she closed the laptop and walked out of the room. That night, I woke up at 2 a.m. drenched in sweat. I'd been dreaming that Roy was in our basement with a sledgehammer, breaking through the wall to the cavern while screaming that he knew what we'd done. My heart was racing, so fast I thought I might be having a heart attack. Megan woke up and turned on the lamp. She asked if I was okay, and I couldn't answer because I couldn't breathe right. She got me water and sat with me while I tried to calm down. She rubbed my back and said maybe we should just tell her father the truth and deal with whatever happened. I asked if she really thought Roy would forgive us for lying to him for months about a fake government department. I asked if she thought he'd understand why we kept the $12 million discovery secret. She was quiet for a while before saying she didn't know. I asked if she thought confessing would make things better or just destroy our relationship with him forever. She said she didn't know that either. I asked if she'd thought about the legal trouble we might face for creating those fake documents and the fake website. She said Christopher thought criminal prosecution was unlikely, but Roy could probably sue us. We sat there in bed at 2 a.m. going through all the same impossible options we'd been going through for weeks. Eventually, Megan turned off the lamp, and we lay in the dark, not sleeping. Roy called Megan the following week to invite us to dinner at this Italian place he loved downtown. He said he wanted to celebrate putting the gold obsession behind him and moving forward with his life. Megan accepted because refusing would have seemed strange. We got a babysitter even though we didn't have kids yet, which made me realize we were already thinking of excuses for future lies. The restaurant was nice with white tablecloths and candles on every table. Roy was already there when we arrived, looking more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. He hugged Megan and shook my hand and told us how good it was to see us. We sat down, and he immediately started talking about his new plans. He said he'd been thinking about taking up watercolor painting because he'd always wanted to try it. He said maybe he'd do some traveling, visit some national parks, finally enjoy retirement properly instead of chasing impossible dreams. He ordered wine and talked about maybe taking a cruise to Alaska to see the glaciers. Megan excused herself to go to the bathroom and was gone for almost 10 minutes. When she came back, her eyes were red. Roy didn't seem to notice. He kept talking about his modest future plans while I sat there barely able to eat my food. He asked about our lives, and we gave vague updates about work and the house. He said he was proud of us for being patient with him during his gold hunting phase. He said he knew he'd been difficult, and he appreciated that we'd supported him even when he was acting crazy. I told him it was fine while pushing pasta around my plate. Megan excused herself again and was gone another 10 minutes. Roy finally asked if she was feeling okay, and I said she'd been having some stomach issues lately. He looked concerned and said we should make sure she saw a doctor. After dinner, Roy hugged us both and said he loved us. In the car, Megan cried the whole way home. I went down to the basement alone one night after Megan fell asleep. I took a flashlight and moved the boxes we'd stacked in front of the opening the plumber had made. I squeezed through into the cavern behind our foundation wall. The space was bigger than I'd realized, maybe 8 feet deep and stretching along most of the back wall. I shined the flashlight around and saw gold veins running through the rock like frozen lightning. They were thick and bright and beautiful and terrible. I stood there in that hidden space behind our house and understood for the first time why people used to go crazy during gold rushes. This wasn't just money. This was something that made you feel like you'd discovered a secret the earth had been keeping. I reached out and touched one of the veins. The gold was cold and smooth under my fingers. I thought about Roy spending his whole retirement searching for this. I thought about him finding that small vein in our basement and believing it was his destiny. I thought about him being right that there was more gold deeper down and how we'd stopped him from finding it with our lies. I used my keys to scratch off a small piece of gold about the size of a quarter. I put it in my pocket and climbed back out of the cavern. Upstairs, I put the gold piece in my desk drawer. I wasn't sure if I was keeping it as a reminder or as evidence of what we'd done. Megan started talking about her dreams a few days later. We were eating breakfast and she suddenly said she'd been having the same dream every night for a week. In the dream, her father found out about the gold and the fake government story. In every version of the dream, he looked at her like he didn't recognize her anymore. She said the worst part wasn't his anger, but his confusion, like he couldn't understand how his daughter could do something like this. She put down her coffee cup and said she couldn't keep living with this secret eating away at our marriage and her relationship with her dad. I pointed out that confessing might destroy both those things anyway. I reminded her about the legal issues with the fake documents. I said Roy could potentially sue us and claim rights to the gold since his excavation led to finding it. She said she knew all that, but at least the truth would be out. I asked her to really think about what would happen if we confessed. Roy would be devastated that we'd lied to him. He'd probably never trust us again. He might sue us and tie up the gold in legal battles for years. We might face fraud charges. And for what? So we could feel better about ourselves? She said maybe feeling better about ourselves mattered. I said maybe protecting our future mattered more. We went back and forth like this for over an hour. Every scenario we came up with had fatal flaws. Tell Roy about the gold but claim we just discovered it? He'd want to excavate it himself, and we'd be back to him destroying the house. Plus, he'd eventually figure out the timeline didn't make sense. Tell him the truth about everything? Destroy our relationship and possibly face legal consequences. Keep lying? Live with the guilt forever. We couldn't find a version of the truth that worked. Ralph called me at work the following Tuesday. He said he needed to know our decision soon about the extraction. He explained that the geological survey he'd conducted wasn't officially permitted because we'd asked him to keep it quiet. He said he was uncomfortable with the legal gray area, and his professional licensing required him to report major mineral discoveries to the proper authorities. He said he'd been willing to wait a few weeks for us to decide, but he couldn't sit on this information much longer. He gave us 3 weeks to either move forward with extraction or he'd have to file the required reports. This added a whole new pressure to the situation. The choice wasn't just ours to make anymore. We had a deadline now. I thanked Ralph for the heads up and said we'd get back to him soon. After the call, I sat in my office trying to figure out what 3 weeks meant. If we did nothing, Ralph would report the discovery, and then what? Would the state actually get involved? Would Roy find out? Would we lose the gold anyway, but also lose Roy's trust? The ticking clock made everything worse. I spent the next 2 days researching what would actually happen if we confessed to everything. I read about fraud laws and civil liability and property rights. I finally called Christopher and asked him to review our situation as a hypothetical legal case. I explained that someone had created fake government documents and a fake website to stop a family member from destructive behavior. Christopher asked a lot of questions about damages and intent and whether the person being deceived had suffered financially. I told him the person actually benefited from being stopped because they were destroying property and ruining their health with obsession. Christopher was quiet for a while before saying that criminal prosecution seemed unlikely because there was no financial victim and the deception actually prevented harm. He said civil liability for emotional distress was possible, but would be hard to prove. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. He said the deceived person could potentially claim rights to any subsequent discoveries since their initial excavation work led to finding the larger deposit. He said a good lawyer could argue that the deception was specifically designed to steal the discovery that the original person had effectively made. I thanked Christopher and hung up feeling worse than before. We couldn't confess without potentially losing everything anyway. Megan brought up the partial truth idea again that weekend. We were sitting in the living room and she said maybe we could tell Roy about the gold, but leave out the fake government intervention entirely. We could say the plumber just discovered it last month and we're still figuring out what to do. I walked through why that wouldn't work. Roy would immediately want to be involved in the excavation. He'd want to use his geology expertise. He'd probably want to move back in and oversee everything. We'd be right back where we started with him destroying the house. Plus, he'd ask questions about timing and permits and surveys. He'd wonder why we hadn't told him immediately. He'd eventually figure out that the timeline didn't match up with what we were saying. Megan said maybe we could claim we were scared to tell him because of what happened before. I said that would just hurt him more, making him think we didn't trust him. We spent 3 hours that afternoon trying to find some version of partial truth that would work. Every scenario had holes. Every story would eventually fall apart under basic questioning. We couldn't find a way to tell part of the truth without the whole thing unraveling. Roy called Megan 2 days before Ralph's deadline. I was at work, but she told me about it that night. Roy had called sounding more excited than she'd heard him in years. He said he'd sold all his mining equipment online and at a local pawn shop. He'd made back about $6,000 total. He said he was using the money to book a cruise to Alaska, something he'd always wanted to do, but never felt like he could afford. He told Megan he felt lighter than he had in years. He said it was like he'd been carrying this heavy weight of obsession and disappointment, and selling the equipment felt like finally putting it down. He said he felt free from the thing that had been consuming him. He thanked Megan for being patient with him and said he was excited to just be her dad again, instead of a crazy old man chasing gold. After Megan told me about the call, we both sat on the couch in silence. She finally said that her father sounded genuinely happy for the first time since her mother died 3 years ago. She said confessing now would destroy that peace. She said she didn't think she could do that to him. I asked if that meant we were keeping the secret. She didn't answer, but we both knew what her silence meant. I called Ralph 2 days later to ask about the timeline. He said Albert's crew was already booked solid for the next 6 months, and we'd gotten lucky with a cancellation window opening up. If we wanted to move forward, we needed to commit within 3 weeks, or they'd fill the slot with another project. Ralph mentioned that Marlene had run new numbers showing that waiting another year could cost us several $100,000 because gold prices were at a peak right now and extraction costs were only going up. Every day we delayed meant watching potential money evaporate. I hung up feeling sick because the pressure wasn't just about making a decision anymore, it was about making it fast. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Megan slept, and I kept calculating what $12 million actually meant. It meant never worrying about money again. It meant our future kids could go to any college. It meant retiring early if we wanted. It meant security for generations. But it also meant lying to Roy for the rest of his life, and that weight felt like it was crushing my chest every time I thought about it. I made an appointment with a therapist the following week, telling Megan I wanted to talk to someone about work stress. The therapist's office was in a medical building downtown, and I sat in the waiting room feeling like a fraud because I couldn't even be honest about why I was there. When the therapist called me back, he was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with glasses and a calm way of talking that made me want to tell him everything. But I couldn't, so instead, I talked around it. I said I had a family member who'd been hurt by something I did, and I wasn't sure if telling them the truth would help or just make things worse. I said I felt guilty, but also thought maybe I'd actually done the right thing even if it was dishonest. The therapist asked me what I thought I deserved as a consequence for my actions, and the question hit me hard because I realized I'd been waiting for something bad to happen. Like I wanted the universe to punish me, so I wouldn't have to punish myself. He pointed out that waiting for punishment was just another way of avoiding responsibility, and that if I really thought what I'd done was wrong, I needed to face it directly, instead of hoping external forces would make the decision for me. I left that session feeling worse than when I arrived, because he'd called out exactly what I was doing. 2 days later, Megan found a folder on my desk with Albert's latest extraction proposal and Marlene's updated financial projections. I'd been meeting with them twice a week for the past month, going over plans and timelines and cover stories, all without telling Megan because I knew she'd try to stop me. She came into the living room holding the folder, and her hands were shaking. She asked me how long I'd been planning this behind her back, and I tried to explain that I was just keeping options open, but she cut me off. She said I'd already made the decision and was just going through the motions of pretending we were deciding together. She said I was steamrolling her objections because the money was too good to pass up, and I was letting greed override everything else, including her feelings and her relationship with her father. I defended myself by saying someone had to be practical, that we couldn't just ignore $12 million sitting under our house while we paid off Roy's damage for years. She asked me when I'd become the kind of person who could rationalize stealing from family, and I didn't have an answer for that. We fought for 2 hours, saying things we'd never said to each other before, and she ended up sleeping in the guest room again. The next morning, she was still barely speaking to me, and I knew I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Roy showed up at our door 3 days later without calling first. I saw his truck pull up and felt my stomach drop because I thought somehow he'd found out. But when I opened the door, he was smiling and holding a wrapped package. He said he'd been cleaning out his garage and found something he wanted us to have. We sat in the living room and he handed me the package, and when I unwrapped it, I found a simple black frame containing a photo of the gold nuggets he'd extracted before Diego shut him down. The nuggets were arranged on a piece of black velvet, maybe 20 of them ranging from pea-sized to marble-sized, and they gleamed in the photo. Roy said he'd gotten the photo printed at a professional place and wanted us to have it as a reminder. He said sometimes the journey matters more than the destination, and that he was grateful we'd supported him even when he was acting crazy about the gold. He said finding those nuggets had been one of the best moments of his life, not because of their value, but because he'd actually done it after years of searching. I held the frame and nodded and said something about how it was a great gift, while inside I was screaming at the irony of accepting this reminder of his dream while planning to take the fortune he never knew existed. Megan sat next to me on the couch, looking like she might throw up, and Roy hugged us both before leaving. After his truck disappeared down the street, Megan took the frame from my hands and put it face down on the coffee table because she couldn't stand to look at it. The plumber called me at work the next afternoon. I'd almost forgotten about him, but his voice on the phone made me remember that he'd seen everything when his hammer broke through into the cavern. He asked if we'd decided what to do about the additional repairs he'd noticed during the pipe work, and I realized he was fishing to see if we were going to do anything about the gold. I told him we were handling it privately and asked if he could come by the house that evening to discuss some follow-up work. When he arrived, I had $5,000 in cash ready in an envelope. I told him we were concerned about property value issues and insurance complications related to what he'd seen, and I needed him to sign a non-disclosure agreement promising not to mention anything about the cavern or its contents to anyone. He looked confused and said he wasn't planning to tell anyone anyway, but I pushed the envelope across the table and said I'd feel better if we had something official. He counted the money, signed the paper I'd printed from a template Christopher had sent me, and left looking slightly dazed. I added his name to my mental list of people I'd paid or deceived to protect this secret, and the list was getting uncomfortably long. Megan told me she was pregnant on a Saturday morning in early March. We'd been trying for a year with no success, and I'd almost stopped thinking about it, but she came into the kitchen holding a pregnancy test with 2 pink lines. I hugged her and we both started crying, but the tears felt complicated because this should have been pure joy, and instead it was tangled up with everything else. She sat down at the kitchen table and said, this changed everything because we weren't just deciding for ourselves anymore. She said $8 million would mean never worrying about college funds or medical bills, never stressing about money while raising our kid. But it also meant raising our child while living with this massive secret, teaching them values we'd violated, building their life on a foundation of lies. We sat there crying together for an hour, and neither of us knew if we were crying from happiness about the baby or sadness about what we were becoming. Later that night, Megan said she kept thinking about our kid asking where the money came from someday and having to lie to them the way we were lying to her father. She said she didn't know if she could do that, and I didn't know either, but we both understood the decision was getting harder to avoid. I spent the next week doing math that made me feel like a terrible person. I calculated that the foundation repairs Roy caused were going to cost us another $40,000 over the next 3 years to fully fix. The house was still compromised, and we'd need to either repair it properly or sell it at a loss. If we took the gold money, we could fix everything right, or we could sell the house and buy something better in a good school district. I calculated what $8 million invested conservatively would generate in returns, and the number was enough to live on without working. I calculated college costs for 1 kid, then 2 kids, then 3, and realized the gold money would cover all of it easily. Every practical argument pointed toward keeping quiet and taking the money. The moral arguments for confession were all abstract, about honesty and integrity and doing the right thing, but the practical arguments were concrete and immediate and about protecting my family's future. I started to feel like maybe the moral choice was actually taking care of my wife and child, and that telling Roy the truth would be selfish, putting my need to feel honest above their need for security. I knew I was rationalizing, but the rationalization started to feel convincing. A week later, Megan told Roy about the pregnancy during one of their regular phone calls. He started crying immediately, talking about being a grandfather and how this was what really mattered in life. He said he couldn't wait to take his grandkid on nature walks and teach them about rocks and minerals as a hobby, not an obsession. After Megan hung up, we both sat on the couch in complete silence for maybe 20 minutes. Finally, she said her father sounded genuinely happy for the first time since her mother died 3 years ago, and that confessing now would destroy that peace. She said she didn't think she could do that to him. I asked if that meant we were keeping the secret, and she didn't answer, but we both knew what her silence meant. I signed the contract with Albert 2 days before Ralph's deadline expired. The paperwork was thick and official, laying out an 18-month extraction timeline with payments structured to look like contractor fees for foundation work. The cover story was that we'd gotten a settlement from Luis for faulty original work, and we were using that money to do extensive repairs. Albert's crew would work during normal business hours to avoid suspicion, using soundproofing and careful techniques to minimize noise and vibration. Marlene had set up a financial structure that would let us pay taxes properly on the gold as it was extracted, making everything technically legal, even if the circumstances were morally questionable. I sat at Christopher's office with the contract in front of me and a pen in my hand, and I thought about calling Megan to ask one more time if this was what we wanted. But I knew if I called her, she'd tell me to stop, and I'd already made the decision in my head even if I hadn't admitted it out loud. I signed my name on 6 different pages, initialed another dozen spots, and handed the paperwork back to Christopher. He shook my hand and said we were doing the smart thing, protecting our family's interests. I walked to my car feeling like I'd just sold something important, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. The Alaska cruise was Roy's idea of celebration, and he insisted on paying for all 3 of us, even though we tried to tell him it was too much. We flew to Seattle and boarded a ship that would spend 7 days sailing up the Inside Passage, stopping at small towns and glacier viewing points. Roy was completely different from I'd ever seen him, relaxed and happy, taking photos of everything with a cheap camera he'd bought specifically for the trip. He pointed out geological formations along the coastline, talking about volcanic activity and glacial erosion with academic interest instead of gold-seeking obsession. When we stopped at a glacier, he stood on the deck with Megan and talked about how ice could shape entire landscapes over thousands of years, how patient natural forces could create beauty without anyone trying to extract value from it. He talked about his plans to be an involved grandfather, maybe teaching our kid about rocks and minerals as a hobby, taking them on nature walks to look at ordinary stones instead of searching for precious ones. Megan and I smiled and took pictures and played along while feeling like complete frauds the entire trip. At night in our cabin, I'd lie awake thinking about Albert's crew starting work in 3 weeks, beginning the extraction that would pull $12 million from the cavern Roy had been standing on top of without knowing. The ship rocked gently, and I could hear Roy's voice from dinner talking about how letting go of the gold obsession had given him his life back. And I wondered if we'd just made the biggest mistake of our lives, or the most practical decision we'd ever face. We got back from the cruise on a Tuesday afternoon, and I pulled into our driveway to see a white van parked in front of the house with Albert's company logo on the side. My stomach dropped because we'd told him to start in 3 weeks, not immediately. Megan saw the van too and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. We walked to the front door and heard equipment running in the basement, the kind of low mechanical hum that meant serious work was happening. Albert met us at the top of the basement stairs with his clipboard and a professional smile. He said his crew had an opening in their schedule, and he wanted to get started on the foundation repairs right away, especially since the permit had come through faster than expected. I hadn't applied for any permit, but I nodded like this made sense. Megan stood next to me frozen, and I could feel her wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Albert walked us downstairs and showed us the soundproofing panels they'd installed against the walls, the vibration-dampening mats on the floor, and the equipment they'd positioned to look like foundation repair tools. Everything was covered with tarps and plastic sheeting that made it look like a legitimate construction project. Two of Albert's crew members were setting up what looked like concrete mixing equipment, but I knew it was actually for processing and sorting the gold. Albert explained the cover story in detail, how they'd tell anyone who asked that we were doing emergency foundation stabilization after discovering additional structural damage during inspection. He handed me a fake permit that looked completely official, with city seals and signatures and a project timeline. Our neighbor Carol knocked on the door 20 minutes after we got home. She was holding a casserole dish and asking about all the construction noise she'd been hearing. I looked at her friendly, concerned face and delivered the rehearsed explanation about foundation problems that the inspector found during routine maintenance. The words came out smooth and natural, like I'd been practicing this lie my whole life instead of just reading it in Albert's email that morning. Carol said she hoped it wouldn't be too disruptive and offered to water our plants if the work got messy. I thanked her and took the casserole and watched her walk back to her house while thinking about how easily the deception had rolled off my tongue. That scared me more than anything else so far. Megan's first ultrasound was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 9 in the morning. We sat in the waiting room surrounded by other pregnant women and their partners, everyone looking excited and nervous in normal ways. The nurse called Megan's name, and we went into the exam room where the ultrasound machine was set up next to the table. Megan lay back and pulled up her shirt while the technician squeezed gel onto her stomach. The screen showed static at first, then the technician moved the wand around and suddenly there it was, this tiny blob with a flickering heartbeat. The technician pointed out what would become arms and legs, explained that the baby was measuring right on schedule for 8 weeks. Megan started crying and squeezed my hand, and I felt this weird split in my chest between pure joy and crushing guilt. The doctor came in after the technician finished and talked about the baby's development timeline, how by the second trimester we'd be able to see more defined features, how by the third trimester the baby would be fully formed and just growing bigger. I sat there doing math in my head, calculating that by the time our child was born, Albert's crew would have pulled millions of dollars in gold from the cavern below our house. The baby on the screen looked so innocent and perfect, and I thought about how we were already lying to protect it before it even had fingers or toes. The doctor asked if we had any questions, and Megan asked about morning sickness and diet and normal pregnancy things. I wanted to ask if it was possible to be a good parent while building your child's future on deception, but instead, I just nodded along and took the ultrasound pictures the technician printed out. We walked to the car in silence, and Megan held the ultrasound photos against her chest. She said the baby was real now, not just an idea, but an actual person we were responsible for. I agreed and started the car and drove us home past the white van still parked in our driveway. 3 months passed faster than I expected. Albert called me at work on a Friday afternoon in October to give me an update on the extraction progress. He said his crew had been working carefully, removing gold in sections to avoid structural instability or creating voids that might cause settling. They'd pulled out approximately $2 million worth of gold so far, all of it processed and stored in a secure facility that Marlene had arranged. Albert explained their method in detail, how they were mapping the veins and extracting in a pattern that maintained the integrity of the cavern walls. He said the work was going better than expected because the gold was even purer than the initial survey indicated. I sat at my desk, listening to him describe the fortune being removed from under my house, while my co-workers walked past my office talking about normal things like weekend plans and fantasy football. Marlene called that evening to walk Megan and me through the financial structure she'd set up. She'd created a mineral rights trust that would receive the gold proceeds, with carefully staged tax payments that would keep everything legal and above board. The money would be distributed over time through what looked like investment returns and inheritance payments, all documented properly to avoid any red flags with the IRS. Marlene showed us spreadsheets with projected growth rates and tax optimization strategies that made my head spin. She explained that we were doing this professionally and legally, that the extraction itself was completely within our rights as property owners with mineral rights in our deed. The circumstances were morally questionable, she admitted, but the execution was sound. Megan asked if there was any way this could come back to hurt us legally, and Marlene said that as long as we followed the financial plan exactly, we'd be fine. The money was becoming real in a way that made it harder to think of this as just a secret we were keeping. It was becoming our actual financial future, something we could touch and plan around and use to build the life we wanted for our daughter. Roy came over on a Saturday morning in November, while Albert's crew was on their scheduled break. We'd timed his visit carefully to make sure no one would be in the basement doing anything that looked like gold extraction. I gave him a tour of the supposed foundation repairs, walking him through the basement and pointing out all the work Albert's crew had done. Roy examined the soundproofing panels and asked technical questions about the foundation stabilization technique they were using. I answered with the information Albert had given me, explaining about the structural supports and the concrete reinforcement and the drainage improvements. Roy seemed genuinely impressed by how thorough the work was. He ran his hand along one of the walls and said it looked like we'd finally hired people who knew what they were doing. He made a joke about how we should have brought in professionals from the start instead of letting him destroy the basement with his gold hunting. I laughed along with him while standing directly above the cavern where his $12 million dream was being systematically removed by the professionals I'd hired in secret. Roy asked how much the foundation work was costing, and I gave him a number that was close to what we'd actually be spending on the extraction. He whistled and said that was expensive but necessary, that structural issues only got worse if you ignored them. We went upstairs and Megan made coffee, and Roy talked about his volunteer work at the elementary school, teaching kids about rocks and minerals. He said it was more rewarding than he expected, that sharing his knowledge without the pressure of finding something valuable had reconnected him with why he loved geology in the first place. Megan asked him about his health, and he said he'd never felt better, that letting go of the gold obsession had taken years off his stress levels. He hugged us both before he left and said he was proud of how we were handling the house repairs responsibly. I watched him drive away and thought about how his happiness was built on our lie, how the peace he'd found was only possible because we'd stolen his dream without him knowing. Megan started showing in her second trimester, and with the visible pregnancy came a depression that her doctor initially attributed to hormones. She'd sit on the couch for hours staring at nothing, not reading or watching TV or doing anything productive. I'd come home from work to find her in the same position I'd left her that morning, still in her pajamas with her hand on her stomach. Her doctor prescribed some pregnancy-safe medication and suggested therapy, but I knew the hormones weren't the real problem. The guilt was eating away at her from the inside, making it hard for her to function or feel joy about the baby growing in her belly. She started making excuses to avoid seeing her father, claiming she was too tired from pregnancy fatigue or too nauseous to leave the house. Roy called concerned after she canceled their third Sunday dinner in a row. He showed up at our house with prenatal vitamins and pregnancy books, being the caring father he'd always been to her. He sat with Megan on the couch and rubbed her back while she cried about how hard the pregnancy was, how she felt overwhelmed and scared about becoming a mother. Roy told her that her mother had felt the same way, that it was normal to be frightened of such a big change. He promised to be there for her and the baby, to help however he could, to be the kind of grandfather who showed up and stayed involved. Megan cried harder after he said that, and Roy thought it was pregnancy emotions making her sensitive. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching this scene and feeling like the worst person alive because Roy was being exactly who he'd always been, a good father who loved his daughter and wanted to support her. He wasn't the villain we needed him to be to justify what we were doing. He was just a man who'd made mistakes and learned from them, who'd found peace after giving up his obsession, and we were punishing him for that peace by stealing everything he'd dreamed of finding. I found Megan in the nursery we'd started setting up, sitting on the floor crying while holding the framed gold nuggets Roy had given us months ago. The frame was supposed to hang on the wall as a reminder of Roy's journey and his acceptance of how things turned out. Megan said she couldn't hang it in our baby's room because it felt like cursing our child with our lies, like starting her life in a space decorated with symbols of our deception. She said every time she looked at those gold nuggets, she thought about the massive fortune we were taking from her father, and she couldn't bear to have that reminder in the room where we'd rock our daughter to sleep. I took the frame from her hands and carried it down to the storage room in the basement, placing it on a shelf behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old college textbooks. We didn't talk about the symbolism of hiding away Roy's gift while simultaneously extracting his fortune from below our feet. Megan went back to the nursery and continued hanging curtains like nothing had happened, but I could see her hands shaking as she measured and marked the wall. That night we lay in bed not touching, both of us staring at the ceiling and thinking our own guilty thoughts. The baby kicked and Megan put my hand on her stomach so I could feel it too. Our daughter was growing stronger every day, becoming more real, and with her growth came the weight of knowing we were building her future on a foundation of lies and stolen dreams. 6 months into the extraction, Albert called with another progress report. They'd pulled out approximately $5 million worth of gold, working steadily through the cavern system and mapping new veins as they went. The extraction was more complex than initially estimated because the gold deposits extended in unexpected directions, but Albert's crew was handling it professionally and carefully. Marlene sent updated financial projections that showed what $5 million could become with proper investment and management. She'd created charts showing generational wealth scenarios, how our daughter could grow up never worrying about money, how our grandchildren could inherit a fortune that would set up their entire lives. The scale of what we were securing for our family started to feel like its own justification, a kind of moral math where providing for descendants outweighed honesty with one person. Marlene walked us through estate planning options and trust structures that would protect the wealth for generations. She talked about college funds and down payments on houses and retirement security with the casual certainty of someone who dealt with large sums of money regularly. Megan asked if this made us bad people, and Marlene said that morality wasn't her area, but financial security definitely was. She said we were making a practical choice to protect our family's future, and that sometimes practical choices required moral compromise. I thought about Roy teaching our daughter about rocks someday, about how he'd show her ordinary stones and explain their properties with the same enthusiasm he'd once reserved for hunting gold. Our daughter would grow up wealthy because of what we took from him, and she'd never know that her college fund and her trust account and her financial security all came from the grandfather who taught her to appreciate worthless rocks. The disconnect between those two realities felt impossible to reconcile, but the money kept growing in accounts that bore our names and our daughter's name, making it harder to imagine any other choice we could have made. Roy called me from the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon in January. His voice sounded weak and scared as he explained that he'd had chest pains that morning and his neighbor had driven him to the emergency room. The doctors were running tests to determine if it was his heart. Megan and I rushed to the hospital and found Roy in a bed hooked up to monitors, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. The doctor came in while we were there and explained that the chest pains were anxiety-related, not a heart attack, but Roy's stress levels were concerning for someone his age. The doctor asked about Roy's lifestyle and stress factors, and Roy explained that he'd actually been living a very peaceful retirement lately, that he'd let go of old obsessions and found contentment in simple things. The doctor seemed pleased and said that Roy's relaxed attitude was probably what had prevented more serious health issues, that reducing stress at his age was one of the best things he could do for his longevity. The doctor literally said that Roy's new peaceful lifestyle had probably added years to his life. Megan and I sat there listening to this, while knowing that Roy's peace came from believing the government had taken his gold, that his relaxed attitude was built on our lie. Roy squeezed Megan's hand and said that giving up the gold hunt was the best decision he'd made in years, that chasing that dream had been slowly killing him, and he hadn't even realized it. He said he was grateful for how things turned out, even though it had been painful at the time. The doctor left, and Roy dozed off from the medication they'd given him. Megan and I sat in the hospital room in silence, both of us thinking the same disturbing thought that we couldn't say out loud. Our deception might have actually helped him. By stopping his destructive gold hunting and making him believe he'd lost everything to the government, we might have saved his life. That realization didn't make the guilt go away, but it added a new complicated layer to it, a sense that maybe we'd done something terrible that accidentally resulted in something good. Albert called in February with news about an unexpected challenge. The gold veins extended further than the original survey indicated, running past our property line and into the neighbor's yard. He'd brought in additional ground-penetrating radar to map the full extent of the deposits, and the results showed that we'd only extracted about half of the total gold available. The rest was technically on Carol's property, the neighbor who'd brought us casserole when the extraction started. Albert said we had two choices: either stop at our property line and leave millions in gold untouched, or find a way to access Carol's property to continue extraction. I called Christopher and explained the situation, asking what our legal options were. Christopher said that if we wanted to continue extraction, we'd need to either get Carol's permission, which would require explaining everything, or purchase her property outright. He asked if there was any chance Carol might be willing to sell, and I remembered her mentioning several times that she was thinking about moving to assisted living. Her house was too big for her to maintain alone since her husband died, and she'd been looking at senior communities closer to her daughter. I talked to Megan about making an offer on Carol's house, and she looked at me like I'd suggested something insane. She said we were already running a secret mining operation under our own house, and now I wanted to buy the neighbor's property to expand it. I pointed out that we'd come this far, and leaving millions in gold untouched seemed wasteful, especially since Carol wanted to sell anyway. Megan asked when this had become about the money, instead of just protecting our house from Roy's destruction. I didn't have a good answer for that. We made Carol an offer the next week, a fair market price that was actually slightly above what comparable houses in the neighborhood were selling for. Carol accepted immediately, thrilled to have a buyer so quickly and grateful that we'd let her stay until she found the right assisted living facility. She hugged us both and said it was wonderful that we were investing in the neighborhood, that having good neighbors like us made her feel better about leaving. We closed on Carol's house in March, signing papers and transferring ownership, while Albert's crew waited to begin extraction on the new property. The whole process felt surreal, like we were playing house with millions of dollars and no one was stopping us. Christopher handled all the legal paperwork and made sure everything was documented properly. Marlene adjusted the financial structures to account for the additional property and the expanded extraction operation. Albert's crew started working from both properties, accessing the cavern system from 2 different entry points to speed up the extraction process. They'd work in our basement for a few hours, then move equipment through a connecting tunnel they'd dug to Carol's basement, then back again. The scale of the operation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when we first discovered the cavern. We weren't just keeping a secret anymore. We were running a covert mining operation across 2 properties, managing a crew of workers, maintaining elaborate cover stories, and processing millions of dollars through complex financial structures. The complexity of it all made backing out feel impossible even if we wanted to. We were too deep into the deception, too committed to the extraction, too invested in the fortune we were building. Carol moved out in April, heading to a nice assisted living place near her daughter in Arizona. She left us a key and asked us to check on the house occasionally until we decided what to do with it. Albert's crew moved in the day after she left, setting up full-time extraction operations in her basement without any neighbors close enough to hear or question the work. I stood in Carol's empty living room watching Albert's team carry equipment through her front door, and I realized we'd crossed another line I hadn't known existed. We'd gone from homeowners protecting our property to operators of an illegal mining operation, from people keeping a secret to people actively expanding that secret into new territory. The weight of what we were doing felt heavier with each decision, but the money kept growing and our daughter kept developing and Roy kept living his peaceful retirement, and somehow all of that made it impossible to stop. Megan's water broke 3 weeks early while we were having dinner at Roy's place. We rushed to the hospital with Roy following in his truck, and the next 12 hours were a blur of contractions and breathing exercises and nurses checking monitors. Roy sat in the waiting room the whole time, refusing to leave even when we told him to go home and rest. When our daughter finally arrived at 6 in the morning, tiny and red-faced and screaming, Roy came into the room and started crying the moment he saw her. He held her with hands that shook slightly, talking softly about teaching her to identify different types of rocks and how the earth was millions of years old and full of wonders. I watched him cradle our baby girl and thought about the millions of dollars sitting in financial accounts, money that would pay for her education and her future and everything she'd ever need. She'd grow up wealthy because of what we took from him, and I couldn't decide if that made us good parents or terrible people. Roy kept whispering to her about geology field trips and nature walks, completely unaware that his granddaughter's trust fund already held more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. We named her Evelyn after Megan's mother, and when we told Roy he had to sit down because he was crying so hard. He said it was the most beautiful gesture we could have made, honoring his late wife by giving her granddaughter her name. 2 days later, he showed up at the hospital with a check for $5,000, telling us he'd set up a college fund for Evelyn. He apologized for not being able to give more, explaining that retirement meant living on a fixed income, and he wished he could do better for his granddaughter. Megan and I accepted the check while knowing that Marlene had already structured accounts holding millions for Evelyn's future, complete with education trusts and investment portfolios that would grow for decades. Roy talked about how $5,000 wasn't much, but maybe it would help with books or supplies when she got older. The weight of his small, generous gesture pressed against the massive fortune we'd hidden, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I couldn't look at him anymore without feeling sick. Albert called me when Evelyn was 2 weeks old to report they were 10 months into extraction and approaching the end of accessible deposits. He estimated 2 more months of work before they'd have to stop, with a final total of approximately $11 million before extraction costs. After expenses and taxes, we'd clear about $7.5 million. The end was in sight, and I felt relief mixed with something darker that might have been dread. Soon the cavern would be empty and restored, and there'd be no more active deception, just the permanent weight of what we'd done. I stood in Evelyn's nursery holding my sleeping daughter and thought about how this fortune would follow her through life, paying for everything she needed while built on a lie to her grandfather. The extraction timeline meant we'd be finished before she was 4 months old, before she'd have any memories, before she could possibly understand what we'd traded for her security. Roy started volunteering at the elementary school near his house, teaching second graders about rocks and minerals twice a week. He'd come over after his sessions and tell us excitedly about how the kids loved looking at specimens under magnifying glasses and learning to identify different types of stones. One boy had brought in a rock from his backyard convinced it was a meteorite, and Roy had gently explained it was just regular granite, while praising the kid's scientific curiosity. He said it reminded him why he'd become a geologist in the first place, back before he got obsessed with finding valuable deposits, and forgot that rocks were interesting just for being rocks. Megan told me later that her father seemed more at peace than he'd been since her mother died 3 years ago. We were forced to admit that the fake government intervention had probably saved him from himself, stopped him from spending his retirement digging holes and chasing dreams that would have killed him from stress. The irony cut deep, because we'd lied to protect our house but accidentally protected him too, and now we were taking the fortune he'd always wanted while he taught children to appreciate ordinary stones. The extraction finished after 12 months total, right on Albert's projected timeline. His crew spent 2 additional weeks carefully restoring both properties, repairing foundations properly, and making the basements look like they'd never been touched beyond normal renovation work. They removed every trace of excavation equipment, filled the cavern access points with concrete and structural supports, and left everything looking completely legitimate. The evidence of what we'd done disappeared into financial accounts and carefully structured trusts that existed only on paper. Marlene came to our house with a leather folder containing our complete financial plan, walking us through asset management and tax strategies and investment portfolios. She congratulated us on becoming wealthy and explained how to maintain discretion while accessing the funds for major purchases or investments. We officially had $7.5 million, and the only proof was numbers in accounts that no one would ever connect to gold extraction or deception or Roy's destroyed dreams. We put the neighbor's house on the market, claiming it was an investment property we'd bought and renovated. It sold for $40,000 more than we'd paid, a small profit that barely registered against our actual fortune, but helped maintain the cover story. We used some of the gold money to do legitimate high-end renovations on our own house, hiring contractors to redo the kitchen with granite counters and new appliances, updating the bathrooms with expensive fixtures, and finishing the basement properly with a home gym and entertainment area. Roy visited during the work and kept saying how amazing everything looked, joking that the foundation repairs had turned out to be a blessing in disguise since we'd ended up renovating the whole house anyway. I agreed with him while thinking about how literally true that statement was in ways he'd never know. The house that he'd nearly destroyed with his excavation was now beautiful and valuable because we'd stolen his fortune and used it to fix everything he'd broken. 6 months after the extraction ended, we settled into our new life as secretly rich people. Megan quit her job to stay home with Evelyn, telling people we could afford it because I'd gotten promoted and we'd received an inheritance from her mother's estate that we'd invested wisely. I kept working at my job even though I didn't need the income anymore, maintaining appearances and having a reason to leave the house and act normal. We were careful not to display wealth, obviously, making gradual lifestyle improvements that could be explained by career success and careful saving. New cars, but not luxury brands, nice vacations, but not constant travel, better clothes, but nothing designer. The lying had become so natural it was almost unconscious, this constant low-level deception woven into every conversation and decision. We'd created an entire false narrative about our financial situation, and we lived it so completely that sometimes I almost believed it myself. Roy's health improved significantly over the next year. His doctor said his blood pressure was better and his stress levels had dropped, attributing it to his peaceful retirement lifestyle and the joy of being a grandfather. Roy took Evelyn on nature walks in the park, showing her different types of rocks and letting her collect pebbles in a little bucket. He'd sit with her on a blanket and talk about how stones were formed over millions of years, explaining geology in simple terms while she played with her collection. Watching them together, I saw him creating the gentle relationship with rocks that he'd never had when he was obsessed with finding gold. He wasn't hunting or digging or chasing value anymore, just sharing his knowledge with his granddaughter and enjoying the science for its own sake. Sometimes I thought we'd made the right choice, even if we'd made it for wrong reasons, because this version of Roy was healthier and happier than the man who destroyed our basement chasing his dreams. Megan and I started going to couples counseling again, finally able to talk more honestly about the secret we were living with, even though we still used vague terms. The therapist helped us process the guilt and develop strategies for living with moral compromise, acknowledging that sometimes there weren't any good choices, and we had to make peace with the least bad option. She talked about how most people lived with some level of deception or moral complexity, and the goal wasn't to achieve perfect honesty, but to find ways to live with our choices without letting them destroy us. The sessions helped more than I expected, even though the guilt never completely disappeared. We learned to separate the secret from our daily life, to be good parents and partners while carrying this weight we couldn't share with anyone else. On Evelyn's second birthday, Roy showed up with a wooden box he'd made himself, filled with small rock specimens he'd collected and labeled with careful handwriting. Each stone had a tag explaining its geological properties, where it came from, and what made it interesting. He knelt down and showed Evelyn the collection, letting her touch each rock while he told her about it in simple words she could understand. Then he looked at both of us and said that the real treasure in life wasn't what you found in the ground, but the people you shared discoveries with, that he'd spent too many years chasing valuable things and almost missed what actually mattered. Megan and I exchanged glances across the birthday cake and presents, and I saw in her eyes the same complex mix of guilt and relief and acceptance that I felt every day. I sat with Marlene in her office downtown while she walked me through the trust documents, page after page of legal language that would lock away Evelyn's future until she turned 25. The structure was complicated on purpose, designed to teach her about money gradually through smaller distributions at 18 and 21 before she got full access to the principal. Marlene explained how we'd tell Evelyn when she was older that the money came from successful investments I'd made and an inheritance from Megan's mother's estate that had grown substantially over the years. She'd created fake investment statements going back a decade, showing a portfolio that grew steadily through careful management and lucky timing. The paperwork looked completely real, backed by actual accounts that existed and held the gold money we'd extracted. I signed the documents while thinking about how we were planning lies that would last decades, building a foundation of deception that would outlive Roy and maybe even outlive us. Marlene handed me copies of everything in a leather folder and told me to keep them somewhere safe, somewhere Evelyn wouldn't find them until we were ready to explain. I left her office carrying the folder and feeling like I was carrying evidence of a crime that hadn't been prosecuted yet. 3 months later, I got a call from Roy saying he was retiring from the elementary school volunteer program. He'd been teaching there for 3 years, showing kids how to identify different types of rocks and explaining geological processes in ways that made science exciting. The school principal called to invite us to a small ceremony they were holding to honor Roy's contributions. Megan and I sat in the back of the elementary school cafeteria, watching Roy stand at a podium in front of about 50 kids and their parents. He talked about how teaching children to appreciate ordinary rocks had taught him more than finding gold ever could, how sharing knowledge was the real treasure, and how he'd finally learned that lesson after wasting years chasing valuable things underground. The kids gave him a card they'd all signed and a framed photo of the rock collection he'd helped them build for their science classroom. Roy cried a little while thanking them, and I sat there feeling the weight of the irony crush down on me because everything he was saying was genuinely true, but also completely built on our lie. After the ceremony, Roy took us to dinner and talked about how free he felt now that he'd let go of his obsession, how teaching had reminded him why he loved geology in the first place. Megan held my hand under the table while her father talked, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing about how we'd destroyed his dream to save him from destroying himself. 2 weeks later, we were on a plane to Hawaii, using money from the gold to book a luxury resort on the Big Island, while telling Roy we'd gotten an incredible deal through a vacation package Megan's work was offering. Roy brought his rock hammer and collection bags, excited to see volcanic formations and black sand beaches. Evelyn was 4 years old now, and genuinely interested in rocks, because Roy had been teaching her since she could walk. I watched them on the beach together, Roy kneeling in the sand showing Evelyn how to identify different types of lava rock while she picked up samples and asked questions. He explained how the islands were formed by volcanic activity, how magma cooled into different types of rock depending on how fast it solidified. Evelyn listened carefully and added rocks to her little collection bag, and Roy looked happier than I'd seen him since before we bought the house. We spent a week exploring the island, visiting volcanic craters and geological sites, with Roy treating it like an educational adventure instead of a treasure hunt. On our last day there, standing on a cliff watching the ocean, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness or absolution, but a kind of acceptance that we were living in the consequences of our choice and making the best of it. Roy had his health and his happiness, and his relationship with his granddaughter, and we had our secret and our guilt and our fortune. The two things existed together, inseparable, and I had to find a way to live with that. Back home, I started making anonymous donations to geological education programs, sending money to universities for scholarships and to schools for science equipment. I donated to mining safety organizations and environmental groups that studied mineral extraction impacts. Megan helped me research the programs, and we'd send checks from accounts that couldn't be traced back to us, using the gold money to do some good, even though we both knew it was partly about making ourselves feel better. One night after we'd sent $50,000 to a geology scholarship fund, Megan said it helped her sleep better, knowing we were honoring Roy's passion for geology while helping other people pursue the science he loved. I agreed, even though I knew we were also just trying to buy some moral credit to balance against what we'd taken. The donations became regular, a few times a year. Always anonymous, always to programs Roy would have supported if he'd known about them. It didn't erase what we did, but it felt like a way to channel the fortune towards something that mattered, to make sure Roy's life's passion created opportunities for others, even if he never knew about it. Roy's 75th birthday party filled our backyard with family and friends, everyone celebrating this man who'd finally found peace in his retirement. We'd rented tables and hired a caterer, using gold money while claiming we'd saved up for the occasion. Roy stood up to give a toast, holding a glass of wine and looking around at everyone gathered. He talked about how the last 5 years had been the happiest of his retirement because he'd finally let go of the obsession that was consuming him and embraced what really mattered. He specifically thanked me and Megan for supporting him through his gold hunting phase and helping him find his way back to sanity, for being patient when he was acting crazy, and for understanding when he needed to fight the government over what he thought was his. He said we'd helped him realize that chasing gold was destroying him, and that losing that fight was actually the best thing that could have happened. I stood there with Evelyn sitting on my lap, this 4-year-old child who would grow up with every advantage we could give her, and I accepted Roy's thanks while knowing she'd never understand the complicated truth of where her opportunities came from. Megan squeezed my hand, and I saw tears in her eyes, and I couldn't tell if they were from happiness at her father's peace or guilt about how we'd created it. 6 months later, Evelyn started kindergarten at an excellent private school across town, the kind of place with small class sizes and advanced programs and tuition that cost more than some people's rent. We told Roy it was covered by scholarships and money from Megan's mother's estate that we'd been saving. He was proud of his granddaughter's opportunities, talking about how important good education was and how Evelyn was so bright she deserved the best. He never questioned how we were affording things because we'd been so careful to keep our lifestyle improvements gradual and reasonable. We'd upgraded our cars, but not to luxury models, renovated the house, but not extravagantly, taken nice vacations, but not obviously expensive ones. The deception had become so woven into our daily life that it was almost invisible, just part of how we moved through the world now. I'd drop Evelyn off at her private school in the morning and pick her up in the afternoon. And she'd tell me about her day while I thought about how the classroom she sat in was paid for with gold her grandfather had dreamed about finding. The other parents at the school assumed we were just successful professionals, maybe both working good jobs and managing money well. Nobody suspected we were sitting on millions extracted from a cavern beneath our house. One night after we'd put Evelyn to bed, Megan came and sat next to me on the couch and said she'd made peace with what we did. Not because it was right, she said, but because she could see the good that came from it. Her father's health and happiness, Evelyn's secure future, our ability to help others through the anonymous donations. She said she thought we were good people who made a morally complicated choice in an impossible situation, that sometimes there aren't any perfect options and you have to choose the least harmful path and live with it. I wanted to believe her, and mostly I did, because the alternative was thinking we were just selfish people who stole from family and rationalized it afterward. We sat there in silence for a while, and I thought about how we'd been married for almost 10 years now, and how this secret had become part of the foundation of our relationship, something we carried together that nobody else could understand. It wasn't the marriage I'd imagined when we bought this house, but it was the one we had, built on lies and gold and love and guilt all mixed together. Roy called a few weeks later, excited to tell us about a new friend he'd made, another retired geology professor named Harold who lived nearby. They'd met at a rock and mineral show and discovered they had similar interests in collecting samples for pure enjoyment rather than value. Roy started going on hiking trips with Harold every weekend, exploring local formations and collecting specimens they'd analyze together later. He told us stories about their adventures, about finding interesting rocks and debating their formation processes, about the joy of studying geology without any pressure to find something valuable. One afternoon, Roy stopped by with Harold to show us their latest finds, and I watched the two old men get excited about ordinary rocks they'd collected from a creek bed. Roy said he was grateful the government had shut down his excavation because it freed him to enjoy geology as a passion instead of an obsession, that losing that fight had actually saved him from wasting his final years chasing something that would have destroyed him. The fact that our lie had directly enabled his happiness was something I'd learned to live with, however uncomfortably, because the alternative of telling him the truth would destroy the peace he'd finally found. Our 10th wedding anniversary came around and Megan gave me a small wrapped box at dinner. Inside was a gold pendant on a chain, and when I looked closer, I recognized it as a piece from the original $8,000 worth of gold Roy had extracted before we stopped him. Megan had kept a small nugget and had it made into jewelry without telling me. She said it represented the choice we made to protect our family, both from Roy's destructive obsession and from the truth that would have destroyed our relationships. She said she wanted me to wear it as a reminder that we'd made this decision together and we'd carry it together. I put the chain on and tucked the pendant under my shirt, feeling the weight of it against my chest. A hidden reminder of our hidden fortune, a piece of the gold that had started everything worn close to my heart where nobody could see it. We finished our anniversary dinner and went home to relieve the babysitter, and I kept touching the pendant through my shirt, feeling it there like a physical manifestation of the secret we'd carry forever. A week later, Christopher Dean called my cell phone asking if we could meet about some new legislation. I drove to his office downtown, and he explained that the state was proposing changes to how residential gold discoveries would be handled, creating actual oversight and regulations that would require reporting any significant mineral finds on private property. He assured me we were legally protected since our extraction was already complete and properly documented through Marlene's financial structures. But the news made me think about timing and luck. If Roy had found the cavern under these new proposed laws, everything might have been different. The government might have actually gotten involved, or there might have been real legal frameworks for handling the situation, or Roy might have had legitimate options we'd denied him with our fake intervention. Christopher said not to worry about it, that the laws wouldn't be retroactive and our situation was completely resolved. I thanked him and left his office, driving home while thinking about how we'd gotten away with it partly through our own planning, but also partly through pure timing, finding the gold in a legal gray area that let us extract it quietly before anyone established rules that might have prevented it. I got home from Christopher's office and found Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table with one of Roy's old geology textbooks open in front of her, the pages showing colorful diagrams of rock layers and mineral formations. She looked up at me with those serious eyes that reminded me so much of Roy and announced that she wanted to be a geologist when she grew up, just like Grandpa. Megan was standing at the counter and I saw her hand freeze on the coffee pot, both of us caught completely off guard by this declaration from our 7-year-old. Roy had been teaching Evelyn about rocks since she could walk, showing her his collection and explaining different types of stones they found in the backyard, but this felt different because she was choosing his passion as her own future. The next weekend, Roy showed up with bags from the science store, pulling out a real geologist's hammer, a magnifying loupe, and a field identification guide for kids. He told Evelyn they were going on their first official geology expedition to a state park an hour away where exposed rock formations made it perfect for beginners. I watched them pack a backpack together with water bottles and notebooks, Roy explaining how real geologists document their findings, and the whole scene made my chest tight because his destroyed dream was becoming her innocent ambition. They started going on these trips every few weeks, Roy driving Evelyn to different locations around the state to look at rocks and collect samples. She'd come home filthy and excited, showing us pieces of quartz or limestone or whatever they'd found, repeating facts Roy had taught her about how old the rocks were and what conditions formed them. Megan and I would smile and act interested, while privately thinking about the irony of our daughter falling in love with the same subject that led to our massive deception and hidden fortune. Roy bought Evelyn a proper rock tumbler for her birthday and set it up in his garage so they could polish stones together. I'd pick her up from his house and find them both bent over the machine, Roy explaining how erosion worked while Evelyn asked questions that showed she was actually understanding the concepts. The bond between them grew deeper every month, built entirely on this shared passion for something that had nearly destroyed our family and made us rich through lies. 3 months after that conversation with Christopher, Marlene called to schedule a meeting about our annual financial review. Megan and I drove to her office downtown and sat across from her polished desk while she pulled up spreadsheets showing our investment performance. The original $7.5 million after taxes had grown to $8.9 million through the careful strategy she'd implemented, diversified across stocks and bonds and real estate investments that generated steady returns. Marlene walked us through each account, explaining how the wealth management had exceeded expectations because we'd been disciplined about not touching the principal and letting compound interest work. She congratulated us on our patience and asked if we wanted to start thinking about estate planning for Evelyn's inheritance, since proper structures now could save significant taxes later. The conversation felt completely surreal because we were sitting in this professional office discussing how to pass on millions of dollars to our innocent daughter, who had no idea her college fund and future inheritance came from gold we'd stolen from her grandfather's discovery. Marlene pulled out sample trust documents and started explaining options for when Evelyn would get access to different portions of the money. Talking about educational trusts and age-based releases like this was normal family planning instead of organizing a fortune built on deception. Megan asked questions about how we'd explain the money to Evelyn eventually, and Marlene suggested we could tell her it came from smart investments and an inheritance from her grandmother, which was technically true if you didn't mention the $12 million in gold that funded those investments. We left her office with folders full of estate planning documents to review, and I drove home thinking about how we were now planning decades ahead for how to maintain this lie across generations. 2 weeks later, Roy called Megan sounding tired and said he'd been having some chest pains and shortness of breath that his doctor wanted to check out. We met him at the hospital where they ran tests and determined it was heart-related issues common for his age, nothing immediately dangerous but requiring monitoring and probably medication. The doctor explained that Roy's heart wasn't pumping as efficiently as it should, and they wanted to do some additional cardiac imaging to see if there were any blockages. Roy sat in the hospital bed making jokes about getting old and falling apart, but I could see the worry in his eyes because his own father had died of a heart attack at 78. We stayed with him through all the tests, and when the cardiologist came back saying Roy needed a specialized cardiac procedure that his insurance would only partially cover, I felt Megan's hand grip mine under the blanket. The out-of-pocket cost would be about $15,000, which was money Roy didn't have in his retirement savings. I told the doctor we'd handle it, and Roy started to protest, but I said it was family, and we weren't discussing it, while internally knowing I was paying for his medical care with money from the gold fortune he'd discovered. We quietly covered the entire procedure cost and worked with the hospital billing to make it look like his insurance had better coverage than it actually did. Roy recovered well over the next few weeks, getting his energy back and joking that he was too stubborn to let a weak heart slow him down when he had a granddaughter to teach about rocks. The ability to help him without him knowing brought this weird mix of relief that we could actually do something good with the money and another layer of guilt because we were literally using his gold to save his life without him ever knowing. Megan and I hadn't had a weekend alone together since before Evelyn was born, always focused on parenting and managing our secret and keeping up normal appearances. Roy offered to take Evelyn for the whole weekend so we could get away, and we booked a cabin 2 hours north in the mountains where we had no plan, except to finally talk honestly about everything. We sat on the cabin's back deck the first night with wine and the forest around us, and Megan started crying before either of us said anything because we both knew what this conversation needed to be. I asked her if she regretted what we did, and she said she regretted that we had to do it. But given the choice again, she'd probably make the same decision because the alternative was watching her father destroy himself in our house. We talked about the guilt that never really goes away, how I still sometimes wake up at night thinking about Roy standing in his garage selling his mining equipment while millions in gold sat hidden under our basement. Megan admitted that every time Evelyn talks about becoming a geologist, she feels sick because our daughter's dreams are built on the same passion we betrayed in her grandfather. We acknowledged that we could never undo what we did, that confessing now would destroy more relationships than it would heal, and that we'd chosen to live with being the kind of people who did this. The conversation went on for hours, covering everything from the fake government intervention to the extraction to the financial planning, laying out all our guilt and relief and complicated feelings about the life we'd built on top of this massive lie. By the end of the weekend, we hadn't found redemption or forgiveness, but we'd found something like peace with our choice, an acceptance that we were going to carry this secret together, and do the best we could with the fortune while honoring Roy in every way, except the one that mattered most. We drove back home holding hands and knowing that this conversation wouldn't be the last one, that we'd probably spend the rest of our lives processing what we did, but at least we were processing it together instead of letting it tear us apart. Evelyn's 8th birthday party was at our house with a geology theme because of course it was, the decorations showing rock formations and mineral specimens. Roy showed up with a wrapped box that was clearly heavy, and when Evelyn opened it, she found his original metal detector, the same one he'd used. When we first bought the house 5 years ago that had found nothing but old nails and a horseshoe in our yard. Roy knelt down next to her and explained that this metal detector had been with him on his first searches for treasure, and now he wanted her to have it for her own adventures. He told her that sometimes the search itself is the real treasure, and that the best discoveries are the ones you make with people you love, not the things you find in the ground. Evelyn hugged him so tight and promised to take good care of it, and I watched this moment thinking about how Roy was teaching her values about the journey mattering more than the destination, values that we'd completely violated by taking his actual destination and hiding it from him. Later that night, after everyone left, I found the metal detector in Evelyn's room next to her rock collection, and I thought about how that device had started everything by bringing Roy to our property in the first place. And now it was passed to the next generation as a symbol of something pure that had nothing to do with the corruption underneath. I stood in our kitchen a few days later looking around at the renovated house that the gold money had paid for, watching Evelyn do homework at the table. While Megan cooked dinner, and Roy's laughter came from the living room where he was reading her a book about volcanoes. The basement below us was beautiful now, completely redone with no evidence of the cavern that had held $12 million in gold veins, the space converted into the home gym we'd originally planned before any of this started. Our daughter was healthy and happy with a secure future, funded by wealth she'd never know the true source of, and Megan's father was alive and content, his health maintained by medical care we paid for with his own discovery. I realized in that moment that we were never going to confess, because the truth would destroy more than it would heal, would take away Roy's peace and Evelyn's innocence and the family stability we'd built on top of our deception. The gold was gone from the cavern, extracted and converted into financial accounts and investment portfolios and trust funds, and the only evidence of what we'd done existed in our conscience and our marriage. We'd chosen to live with being the kind of people who did this, who lied to family and stole a fortune and built a good life on top of moral compromise, and somehow that was going to have to be enough. Roy would never know that his greatest discovery happened and was taken while he fought a fake law we'd created, would never know that his granddaughter's future was secured by the motherlode he'd spent his retirement searching for. Megan and I would carry that knowledge alone, using the fortune to build the best life we could for Evelyn while honoring Roy's passion for geology in every way except the one that mattered most, which was the truth.